Revolutionary soldiers never knew what time would do to their battlegrounds. They never imagined those fields would be called haunted for centuries. It began as nothing more than high ground on a gray morning, a strip of mud and grass chosen for its firing angles and cover. Men marched in, muskets on their shoulders, convinced history would remember the victory, not the soil beneath their boots. Yet today, more than 200 years later, visitors still stand on that same ridge and report the same impossible things. Volleys of gunfire in an empty fog, shouted orders in a language no one speaks nearby, the smell of black powder when the air is still. Officially, it's just another preserved battlefield on a tourist map. Unofficially, the local police logs show late-night calls from drivers who swear they saw marching lines, where there is only open field. Park rangers quietly compare notes on radios that crackle with voices from nowhere. The soldiers who fought here believed the battle would end when the firing stopped. They were wrong. Something stayed. And if you listen closely, as the light fades over this forgotten ground, you may start to understand why no one agrees on what still moves after dark. The ridge that wouldn't go silent ridge didn't look like a place that would outlive the men who bled across it on the morning the fighting began. It was nothing more than a weather-beaten rise under a dull, uncooperative sky. Frost clung to the grass, breath formed quick clouds in the air. No one standing there could have imagined that long after their bones had vanished, people would still hear them. The first shots cracked before anyone expected them. Not the orderly volley each side had drilled, but the sharp, scattered fire of soldiers catching movement in the fog and reacting to fast. Witnesses later wrote that the fog seemed to move in ways they couldn't explain, sliding in thick waves across the ridge as if something beneath it was breathing. Most letters dismissed this as exhaustion. A few didn't. Men rushed forward, slipping in frozen mud, shouting to find their officers through the shifting white curtain. One soldier described it as running through a world that had lost its edges. He was last seen raising his musket. His body was never found. His name appears on casualty lists, but no grave marker ever carried it. When the main lines finally engaged, the ridge erupted with sound musket fire, powder smoke, bayonets clashing in frantic bursts, the kind of noise the earth absorbs and remembers. Officers shouted orders that were swallowed by wind. Drummers tried to keep the tempo, but their rhythm broke again and again under the chaos. According to 3 separate reports, a short series of commands was heard from the right flank at the height of the battle. No officer on either side claimed to have issued them. By midday, the fog had thinned enough to reveal the cost. Bodies lay in crooked rows, some exactly where they fell, others dragged by comrades trying to pull them behind cover. The air still stung with the metallic taste of spent powder. The surviving officers began collecting casualty names, but several men reported seeing movement on the far slope, not enemy troop shapes, figures, distilled to be living, dissolved to be smoke. Most assumed it was the mind playing tricks in the aftermath of fear, but the same detail repeats across multiple accounts. No matter how closely a soldier stared, he could never see the shapes clearly. They always stood just beyond certainty, as if the ridge wanted to keep something partially hidden. When the field was finally secured, the men expected the sounds of battle to fade. But at dusk, as the last wounded were carried away, the drums returned, not full beats, more like distant taps, faint and uneven, as though someone practiced a march long out of step with the world. Officers blamed wind against broken branches. Soldiers knew better. They had lived through the sound of men signaling fear, and what they heard that evening was not one letter, written by a captain who died weeks later in another skirmish, describes a moment that disturbed him more than any British volley. As he and a small group gathered abandoned equipment, he heard someone whisper his name behind him. He turned, expecting one of his men. No one stood there. His men were still 30 yards away. He wrote that the voice sounded exactly like a soldier who had died earlier that morning. After the battle officially ended, the ridge should have slipped back into quiet. Instead, the reports continued. A night guard posted near the tree line swore he heard footsteps circling him, steady and measured, but he never saw a source. Another swore he felt someone brush past his shoulder in the dark, though the ground around him was bare and still. A lieutenant claimed he heard the same command shouted twice, once by a living officer and once by something that echoed it moments later in perfect rhythm. Nothing was recorded in the formal logbooks. Commanders wanted clean records, not rumors. But the men remembered. The atmosphere on the ridge after sundown changed. Patrols moved faster. Conversations grew shorter. No one lingered alone. And as their ranks thinned over the following months, the stories traveled with them quietly, privately, never in front of officers. The strangest report emerged near the end of the campaign. A squad sent to recover abandoned supply crates found the ridge unusually silent. Even the wind felt absent. As they approached the center slope, they saw a lone figure standing where the heaviest fighting had taken place. The soldier raised his hand as if signaling them forward, but the gesture was wrong, slow, almost deliberate. The movement of someone who didn't fully understand how to command a human body. The squad leader called out. No answer. The figure stood motionless. When they advanced, it took a single step backward and dissolved into the fog as though stepping behind an invisible curtain. The men searched the area and found nothing but churned mud and a drop canteen covered in frost. That didn't match the night's weather. No one filed a report. They simply left the crates behind and marched back before sunset. What makes that account unsettling is that 5 different men rattled the same moment years later, independently of one another, without altering the smallest detail. They described the fog, the posture of the figure, the gesture that felt almost human, but not quite right. Every man insisted they hadn't imagined it. The army eventually moved on, leaving the ridge to silence. But silence wasn't what came next. Travelers used the route rarely, and when they did, they reported strange pressure in the air. As though sound itself grew heavier, some said they heard conversation carried on windless days. Others said they saw patterns in the soil that resembled footprints even after rainstorms. The ridge seemed to retain something. Not ghosts, at least not in the way stories usually describe them. More like impressions burned into the landscape, replaying fragments of a day that refused to end. Years later, when the revolution had already reshaped the country and the battlefield had become an indistinct memory, a visitor walking the ridge at dusk claimed he heard a voice whisper a name he did not know. He described it as the kind of whisper meant to guide someone back into formation. He left the ridge quickly and never returned. All these stories share one detail. None of the witnesses believed they were encountering the dead. They believed the land was repeating something incomplete, something that had never been finished on the day of the battle. And that belief raises one question that has followed this ridge through centuries. From soldiers to villagers to officers who tried to deny it, if a battlefield can keep retelling one moment, what happens when it decides the moment isn't over? The ground gives no answer, but something on the ridge moves after dusk, and whatever it is, it hasn't stopped since the day the fog swallowed the first volley. The village that lived with echoes long after the soldiers left. The ridge settled into a strange kind of quiet. Grass grew back over the scars, trees reclaimed the slopes, and the wind finally moved without carrying the smell of powder. For a moment in history, it looked as if the land was ready to forget, but the ridge never truly stopped speaking. It only changed who it spoke to. The village rose slowly on the southern edge, just a cluster of wooden homes, a church steeple, and a dirt road that carried wagons more often than stories. People here worked the land without caring who had fought over it. They were practical, stubborn, and uninterested in ghost tales told by passing travelers. At least, at first, the earliest report came from a farmer named Alden Pierce, a man known for his discipline. He kept exact records of weather, harvest weights, and planting cycles. He was not the type to imagine voices, but one early spring morning, as he guided his plow across soil that had once run red, he froze mid-step. His horse had halted on its own, ears pricked, body trembling. Pierce heard it too soft, synchronized steps moving behind him. He turned slowly, expecting to find a neighbor. The field behind him was empty, yet the steps continued, each one landing exactly where the last had. As though someone followed a marching route laid out centuries earlier, Pierce returned home pale, shaking and silent. For weeks, he avoided the ridge entirely. When he finally spoke, he described the sound as footsteps that did not belong to this century. News traveled through the village quietly. People didn't gossip loudly about it, because no one wanted to entertain the idea that the battlefield had kept something alive. The older families called it imagination. Younger ones called it old soldier spirits. The church called it unresolved tragedy. No explanation fit comfortably. But one detail spread quickly. Everyone who heard something on the ridge insisted they weren't imagining it. They insisted it felt real enough to touch. As the village grew, so did the stories. Children woke at night claiming to hear drumming coming from the eastern slope. One boy described the rhythm perfectly, matching it to a formation signal historians recognized but most locals had never heard of. A mother brought her daughter to the priest because the child refused to sleep alone, saying a man stood outside her window whispering for her to get back in line. Her window faced the ridge. The priest listened carefully, writing each detail in neat script inside a leather-bound confessional journal. None of his entries made it into official church records, yet the journal survived, and within its pages lies one unsettling pattern. Every confession tied to the ridge carried the same tone. Not fear of the dead, fear of something unfinished. Visitors from nearby towns sometimes heard the rumors, laughed, and walked the ridge at night to prove nothing was there. Some returned making jokes about shadows. Others returned very differently. One merchant, passing through on his way south, decided to camp on the ridge to save time. He lay awake just after dusk, staring at the stars through a thin blanket of clouds. That's when he heard the murmurs low, heavy, and close. Not words he could make out, but the cadence of commands. He sat up fast, thinking he'd been discovered by local patrols. No patrol stood near him. The murmurs continued, circling him, tightening. The man didn't pack his things. He left them scattered in the grass and sprinted downhill toward the village. His wagon remained abandoned until morning, his horse still tied to it, sleepily chewing hay as if nothing unusual had happened. The villagers knew enough not to ask details. People who encountered the ridge at night rarely wanted to relive it. Time passed. Houses multiplied. The church bells rang every Sunday. The ridge became a familiar backdrop, a silhouette people grew up seeing from their windows. But its presence settled into the rhythms of daily life, quiet, constant, and never fully trusted. No one walked it alone after sunset. The strangest of all accounts came from a woman named Mara, who lived in a small cabin close to the northern slope. She was known for her stillness, the kind of person who spoke only when necessary. One late autumn evening, she left her cabin carrying a lantern to gather firewood. The path curved gently toward the ridge before looping back into the trees. Mara walked slowly, steady and unbothered by the dark. Halfway down the path, her lantern began to dim, not flicker, not sputter dim, as though the light was being pulled from it. She breathed once, steadying her hand. Then she heard it, the clatter of a musket dropped onto frozen ground. A very old sound, a very heavy one. She turned toward the noise, lifting the lantern. Its light struggled, barely illuminating the edge of the ridge. She saw nothing, yet the air shifted. Something approached, not with footsteps, but with presence, the feeling of a shape moving through space without disturbing the leaves. She stepped back, but the sensation followed her, matching her retreat. Her lantern went out, completely. In the darkness, she heard breath, not her own. She didn't run. Mara later said running felt useless because whatever stood near her wasn't chasing. It was observing, waiting for something. She whispered a prayer, stepped backward again, and the presence eased away, dissolving into the cold air. Her lantern flickered back to life on its own. She returned home, locked her door, and moved her bed away from the window. When she described the moment to the priest, she said one thing that stayed with him for years. It wasn't a ghost. It was a memory that knew I didn't belong there. By the turn of the new century, the village had learned to speak of the ridge with the same care reserved for weather omens and unmarked graves. They didn't deny it. They didn't dramatize it. They simply adapted. Families warned newcomers gently. Keep your children indoors on fog-heavy nights. Don't whistle near the ridge after dusk. If you hear footsteps, do not answer. If someone calls your name, check who is speaking before you respond. Most lived peacefully under these unwritten rules. And then came the night that unsettled even those who had grown up with the ridge. It began with a single church bell, ringing once, an accidental tone, the kind that happens when someone brushes against the rope, but no one had touched it. The bell rang again, louder. Villagers rushed outside to see who had entered the tower. The door was locked. As they gathered beneath the steeple, a sound drifted down the slope, a formation march, slow, rhythmic, impossible to mistake. It echoed across the fields, the exact pattern soldiers had once used to reposition before firing. A few men moved toward the ridge, determined to see who was out there. Their wives grabbed their sleeves and refused to let go. The marching grew louder, sharper, until it reached the very edge of the village. It stopped. Silence expanded outward. No wind, no birds, no breath. Then one final sound drifted from the ridge, carried by air that suddenly felt colder than the season allowed. A command, spoken clearly, in a voice no one recognized. The villagers stood frozen, staring into the darkness above them, waiting for the next sound. But none came. The ridge returned to stillness. The bell rope hung untouched, and those who had gone outside that night never agreed on what the command meant. But every witness could agree on one thing: it wasn't meant for them. It was meant for someone who hadn't answered in more than 2 centuries. And for the first time in the village's history, people began to wonder if the ridge was not just replaying what had happened, but waiting for what should have happened next. The classified night exercise at the ridge entered a long sleep after the village began avoiding it. Seasons shifted, families changed, and the land settled into the kind of quiet that feels intentional. For decades, no one walked the slope without purpose. And for decades, nothing unusual happened, at least. Nothing that reached public ears. Then the military came back. It began with surveyors in crisp uniforms pacing the fields at dawn, taking readings, marking positions with orange flags. Their presence rattled the village more than anyone admitted, because people here had lived long enough to understand one thing clearly. The ridge responded to soldiers. No one wanted to see what it would do with modern ones. The army chose the ridge as a training ground for night exercises. It was practical, wide, and isolated enough to simulate real battlefield maneuvers. Trucks rolled in, bringing radio equipment, temporary shelters, and dozens of young recruits who had never heard a single rumor about the place. To them, it was just another assignment. The first drills went smoothly. Movement, positioning, communication checks routine. But something shifted on the third night, when a fog settled over the ridge with the same unnatural weight, described in accounts centuries old. A few soldiers joked about horror stories to pass time. Others fell quiet, and then the radios began acting strangely. At 20 to 14, the first report came in: interference. Nothing unusual: static, brief distortion, the kind you expect in uneven terrain. But then one of the squad leaders paused mid-transmission, listening to something no one else could hear. When asked to repeat his last call, he hesitated. "Did someone just relay an order on your channel?" he asked. No one had. He insisted he'd heard it clearly, an old-fashioned command phrased in terms no modern officer used. His voice sounded forced, clipped, like he was still trying to convince himself it was just cross-signal bleed. It wasn't the last strange report. Over the next hour, 2 soldiers claimed their earpieces picked up marching steady, rhythmic, close, as though a formation passed right by them. One recruit ripped off his headset entirely, insisting someone had whispered a number sequence into his ear. The sequence didn't match any code they used. At 23:03, something happened that no one on the ridge could rationalize. Squad Delta, assigned to sweep the western slope, vanished from radio contact. Not lost, signal vanished. Their trackers still blinked steady on the monitor, showing their exact position. But when the search team reached that coordinate, the squad was nowhere. No footprints in the mud, no lights, no gear. Just cold air and the heavy sense of being watched from somewhere uncomfortably close. 10 minutes later, the squad reappeared over 100 yards from the marked position, confused, disoriented, and insisting they had never moved. All for claim they had been standing still, waiting for further instructions, wondering why the rest of the unit had gone silent. Their watches were synchronized to the minute, except one. Private Lang's watch lagged by 6 minutes, as if the time around him had thickened or hesitated. The others didn't notice until later. Lang himself refused to speak about it. The officers dismissed the anomaly publicly. Privately, a small classified investigation team was assembled. They weren't ghost hunters or storytellers. They were analysts, technicians, and psychologists, trained to explain unusual field events. Their findings were thin. One officer described the ridge as having acoustic behavior inconsistent with geography. Another mentioned time perception distortion under fog conditions. A third wrote a sentence that was later redacted entirely. However, one report survived without edits, written by a communications specialist named Rowan Hale. His wording was strangely cautious. There are transmissions on this ridge that originate from no identified source. They appear selective, as though reacting to movement patterns. They do not match any frequency in our system. Several witnesses later mentioned that Hale spent an unusual amount of time walking the ridge alone at night. He carried the radios, testing both frequencies, stopping often, adjusting settings, listening intently. One fellow officer described seeing him pause suddenly, as if someone had touched his shoulder. 3 days later, Hale turned in a sealed envelope to his commanding officer. No one knows what he wrote. That night, he packed his gear and requested immediate reassignment. By morning, he was gone. The military drills continued, but the tension grew heavier. Recruits moved in groups even during daylight. No one volunteered for night watch. And still, the ridge persisted. One evening, during a low-visibility drill, a sergeant named Redfield approached the tree line to retrieve a misplaced training dummy. He walked slowly, thinking he saw the silhouette leaning against a fallen log, but the closer he got, the more wrong the shape became. Too tall, shoulders to square. The uniform, if it was a uniform, looked like something from another era. He called out. No answer. He raised his flashlight, and the beam flickered as if struggling against some invisible resistance. In the half-light, the figure turned its head, not fully just enough for Redfield to feel certain it was aware of him. He stepped back. The shape dissolved in the fog so quickly it felt deliberate. Redfield returned to the command tent without the dummy. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, officers blamed shadows and nerves, but when technicians checked the flashlight Redfield carried, they found the bulb intact, the battery full, the circuitry undamaged. The device simply failed at that exact moment. That was the night the base commander made a decision he didn't put in his report. No soldier would stand alone on the ridge again. Teams moved in pairs. Search grids were tightened. The drills were shortened, but the ridge had already learned how to respond to them. Shadows formed where no trees stood. Footsteps circled patrols at angles that defied terrain. Radios crackled with messages in flat, emotionless voices that used outdated military phrasing no recruit could recognize. And then came the incident no one could dismiss. During a late-night simulation, the fog thickened again, swallowing visibility to arm's length. The units were instructed to regroup at the southern boundary. One soldier, Davis, began jogging toward the signal flare, but stopped abruptly. He felt a hand on his sleeve, a firm grip, a soldier's grip. He turned, expecting his squad mate. No one was there, but the hand didn't let go. Davis yanked free, stumbling backward. His radio erupted with static so violent it drowned out his own breath, and through that static, a single voice cut through, sharp, commanding, precise. Hold your line. The words were old, too old. When Davis reached the regroup point, he collapsed. His sleeve showed the clear outline of a handprint, pressed into the fabric by something colder than the night around him. That was the last official night exercise on the ridge. The military packed up within 48 hours. No explanations, no goodbyes. No attempt to reassure the villagers who watched silently as the trucks rumbled away. They left behind only the marks of their tires, a few forgotten stakes in the grass, and one lingering question that no one dared voice aloud. The ridge had awakened when soldiers returned. What would it become now that they had abandoned it again? On the first night after the withdrawal, long after the village lights dimmed, and long after the last military vehicle disappeared down the road, the ridge released a sound no living soldier had ever heard there before. A single musket clicked out slow, deliberate, waiting for the next command. Tourists, reenactors, and the things they don't post online by the time the military left. The ridge looked peaceful again, too peaceful. Grass swayed in long, gentle strokes. The trees rustled softly, and birds returned to branches that had been crowded with antennas and equipment for months. To outsiders, nothing suggested what had happened there, but the villagers moved differently for weeks, quieter steps, earlier nights, a watchful edge in their eyes. It didn't take long before the land was repurposed once more. A regional committee selected the ridge for preservation, announcing plans to transform it into a historical site that honored a revolutionary battle. Few people remembered in detail. The village nodded politely, hiding their unease behind respectful smiles. Outsiders did not understand what the ridge carried. Outsiders never did. Signs went up first, clean wooden posts with engraved maps and brief paragraphs about troop positions. Then came the gravel paths, benches, parking space, and brochures printed on glossy paper. A small visitor center opened its doors with a cheerful ribbon-cutting ceremony. A reenactment group from a nearby city volunteered to perform annual demonstrations, eager to bring history alive. The ridge listened to all of it. The first tourists arrived in early summer. Couples with cameras, students on field trips, retired veterans tracing the past with their fingertips. Most walked the guided paths without incident, admiring the view, snapping photos, saying the same lines every visitor says when they want to feel connected to history. But a few walked off the marked trail, and those were the ones who returned with stories they struggled to explain. One man, a teacher visiting with his wife, lingered near the tree line after the tour ended. He stood with his hands behind his back, silently reading a metal plaque that described the final moments of the battle. His wife called for him twice. He didn't answer. She approached and found him staring into the woods, his face drained of color. "There are men in there," he whispered. "Not people, men." As if he already knew they weren't modern. She followed his gaze, but saw only trees. He refused to walk past that point for the rest of the visit. They didn't post that part in their online review. That same week, a family recorded a video on the ridge, a wide-shot panorama meant to capture the landscape. The father panned the camera slowly, narrating casually. Later, when they watched the clip at home, the mother pointed to the left side of the frame. A faint silhouette stood behind them for 2 seconds before dissolving into the background. A tall figure, shoulders squared, posture rigid. They reported a technical glitch to the visitor center. They never shared the video publicly. More unsettling were the reenactors. They arrived in detachments, dressed in period uniforms, carrying replica muskets and drums. They marched with pride, practiced maneuvers, laughed, sweated, and posed for photos with visitors. But as soon as night approached, their mood shifted. One reenactor, known for his dry humor, refused to stay after dusk during the first event. When pressed, he said he'd heard someone issue a command from the far slope in an accent he couldn't place. The phrasing sounded too authentic, too exact, not the theatrical style they used during demonstrations real. Another reenactor reported a strange sensation during a mock charge. As he ran down the ridge, shouting with the rest, his foot caught something that wasn't visible. He stumbled hard, landing face first in the grass. When he glanced back, he swore he saw a boot print forming in the soil, right where he had tripped. Not his, not anyone's from the reenactment. A third claimed that during a foggy rehearsal, he felt someone brush past him from behind, hard enough to spin him slightly. He yelled, thinking a fellow actor had pushed him, but the man behind him insisted he had been several steps away. The brush felt like a soldier in formation, moving forward without breaking rank. None of these testimonies appeared in event reports. The visitor center chose to highlight the cheerful Parks family photos, historical facts, picnic areas, reenactment schedules. Meanwhile, the locals watched the ridge absorb every new footstep, every new reenactment drum, every word spoken in the language of battle. They could feel the land remembering again, responding again, as if some part of it recognized the patterns, lines of men, commands shouted, formations spread across old scars. But the most disturbing incident came during the late autumn tour. The air was cold enough to sting, but clear enough for distant hills to shine under pale blue sky. A guide led a small group along the central trail, stopping at the highest point where the battle had turned chaotic centuries earlier. He spoke calmly, explaining troop movements, then his voice faltered. The visitors watched him stare past them, his eyes fixing on something at shoulder height behind the group. One woman turned nervously, expecting another tourist walking up the path. No one stood there, but the guide continued staring, his mouth slightly open, breath short. He described the moment later as seeing someone standing just above the ground surface, not floating, not fully visible, but half-formed, a figure bending forward as if trying to listen. The guide ended the tour early that day. He never returned to that spot alone. As winter approached, the ridge changed again. The branches grew skeletal, the wind sharper. Foot traffic slowed, but the few who insisted on hiking in the cold months noticed a different kind of silence. Not peaceful, expectant. One visitor, a young woman fascinated with historical sites, took a solitary walk along the ridge near sunset. She was not frightened easily. She enjoyed exploring places with complex paths. She lingered near the old battlefield center, watching mist gather in the hollow. She heard breathing, not hers, deeper, rhythmic, coming from her left side. She spun, heart pounding, but saw nothing. No movement, no shape. The breathing stopped. She exhaled shakily and stepped backward. Her boot pressed into the soil, and something pressed back. The ground seemed to shift under her heel, as if another foot had landed simultaneously. Mirroring her movement exactly, she ran. When she reached her car, she realized she had forgotten one detail. Her phone's camera had been recording the entire time. The video file was silent except for one until the moment she stepped backward. At that second, a faint, layered exhale played through the speakers, heavy, close, human. She deleted the video before she reached home. People don't share the real stories, and the ridge seemed to know that. The incidents grew more frequent, yet less explainable. Visitors reported hearing a single command spoken softly beside them with no one else nearby. Others claimed their photos captured figures no one saw in person. A few left the ridge shaking, insisting they had walked through a cold patch that felt like stepping into another time. Through all of this, the village kept its distance, watching from windows when tourists lingered too late. Locals knew what was coming long before the first visitor center employee admitted it aloud. The ridge was becoming active again. One evening, long after closing hours, the night guard patrolled the visitor center grounds. His flashlight traced clean lines across the empty path. The moon hung low, cold and quiet. He heard boots marching slow, disciplined steps approaching from the ridge. He froze. The sound grew louder, clearer, until it reached the edge of the visitor trail and stopped. Nothing moved, but the guard felt someone stand directly behind him. He didn't turn. He didn't breathe. He simply stood there, feeling a presence that had waited centuries to be acknowledged. Then a voice, steady, low, unmistakably military, spoke to words beside his ear. Fall it. The guard broke into a sprint, not stopping until he reached the village boundary. No one knows what he saw in the moment after he turned his back. He never described it, not once. But that night, the villagers noticed something new. The ridge did not just echo the past anymore. It was beginning to act as if the past needed to continue. And the next sign of that change arrived with the following sunrise, something none of them expected. Something that made even the oldest families pull their curtains tighter and whisper prayers under their breath. Tracks, rows of them, perfect, evenly spaced footprints leading from the ridge toward the village, as if a formation had finally decided to march forward. What a haunted battlefield really means. Villagers found the footprints at dawn, a long chain of impressions marching out of the ridge and straight toward town. Frost rimmed each one, as though the ground had been pressed by something colder than the night itself. The tracks held perfect military spacing, no stagger, no drift, no hesitations. Every print faced forward, unwavering. Everyone felt the air change. Children were ushered indoors. Doors closed early. Windows stayed locked even when the winter sun rose weak and harmless. No one spoke loudly. The ridge, once a distant weight on the edge of life, had stepped toward them, and that shift, small, silent, undeniable, felt like the breaking of something that had held for centuries. By midday, the footprints had thawed in patches, but the memory of them stayed sharper than any outline. A few men followed the trail to where it stopped, the old boundary stone between village land and battlefield soil. The prints ended there, as if a line existed that even the unseen refused to cross. But lines don't hold forever. A week after the footprints appeared, a historian named Elias Roth arrived. He was quiet, meticulous, and known for digging into war records until patterns emerged where others saw none. He had heard whispers about the ridge from a former officer who'd trained there. No official report, just a careful sentence spoken over coffee. Some places don't stay buried. Roth didn't say much when he arrived. He asked for old letters, diaries, anything from the era of the first battle. The villagers gave him copies, but not originals. They watched him move through the town like a man stepping into someone else's memory. He walked to the ridge alone. At sunset. When he returned hours later, his face was pale. His hands shook slightly, not from cold, but from something unspoken. He didn't describe what he experienced. Instead, he asked a question no one had expected. Did the soldiers who fought here leave anything unfinished? Orders not followed? Messages never delivered? The room fell silent. The villagers exchanged careful glances. Finally, an elder spoke. They say the last command of that battle was never obeyed. No one knows why. Men claimed they heard it. Others said it was never spoken. Roth leaned forward. What was the command? The elder hesitated. When he finally answered, his voice was softer than a prayer. Advance. That word settled heavily in the room. The ridge had marched once. Now the reason felt clearer than anyone wanted it to be. Roth requested access to the old battlefield logs, records kept by the revolutionaries themselves. He wasn't expecting to find much, but as he flipped through brittle pages in the village archive, he found something odd. A repeated notation in different handwriting across multiple dates, awaiting signal. It appeared in the margins, in letters, in a log of a dying captain who could barely write, a phrase scattered across accounts with no clear meaning. Roth frowned, tracing the words with a fingertip. Someone had expected another command. Someone had believed the battle was paused, not finished. That night, the ridge stirred again. Fog settled earlier than usual, thick and unnatural, rolling down the slopes in long, steady sheets. The fields vanished under it. Lights in the village flickered. Dogs refused to go outside. And then the old sound returned, not faint this time, not drifting, but purposeful marching. Closer than before, Ross stepped outside, drawn by something beyond curiosity. The villagers shouted for him to come back, but he didn't listen. He walked toward the boundary stone where the footprints had stopped days earlier. The fog parted slightly, revealing the faint outline of the ridge. He heard voices, dozens of them, low, tense, speaking in tones soldiers use when waiting for an order that could change everything. He whispered a single word, "Why?" The voices fell silent. The fog thickened, folding in around him, then softened just enough to reveal the shape of a man standing alone at the foot of the ridge. Not transparent, not glowing, simply present, as if sculpted from a memory too solid to break. His uniform was wrong for this century. His posture carried weight, his head lifted slowly, as though sensing Roth's presence. Roth called out, his voice trembling. "What are you waiting for?" The figure didn't answer with words, but the ridge did. The air vibrated with a low, bone-deep resonance like a drum struck from beneath the earth. Then a single musket shot echoed across the fields, not from the past, but from the fog in front of him. The figure stepped forward. Roth stumbled back, tripping over the boundary stone. The fog surged toward him. Villagers rushed forward, grabbing him, dragging him inside. By the time the door slammed shut, the fog had retreated, rolling backward as if pulled by unseen hands. Ross sat trembling by the hearth, staring at nothing. "They're not haunting us," he said finally. "They're completing something they never finished. They don't know the battle ended. They're still waiting for the order to advance." The villagers listened in stunned silence, and now, someone whispered. Roth looked toward the window where fog still pressed against the glass. Now they think they heard it. A long pause hung in the room. The fire crackled. Outside, the fog moved with slow, deliberate weight. "Did you hear something?" the elder asked quietly. Roth nodded once, barely breathing. "Yes, someone spoke, but it wasn't me." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to, because just after midnight, when the village had finally fallen still, a new sound drifted from the ridge, one no one had heard in centuries. Not marching, not commands, not muskets. It was the sound of metal scraping against metal, as if thousands of bayonets were being fixed at the same time in a formation you couldn't see. The fog pulsed once. The air tightened, and for the first time since the battle ended, the ridge sounded ready to move forward.